In January 1973, a young woman went missing in a quiet Michigan farming community.
When Dawn Magyar was abducted, it was unnerving. It was just chilling. Could something like this happen in broad daylight? That's impossible in this area.
6 years later, a 16-year-old high school student was murdered in similar circumstances just 40 miles away.
It was strange. The location where her body was found, you could almost superimpose on top of Dawn Magyar's scene where her body was found.
Jerald Wingeart followed a pattern. He would trawl rural towns and college campuses for young women to abduct, to rape, sometimes to kill.
He would get into his vehicle and he would go cruising. He was out looking for a victim.
Wingeart got away with murder for 3 decades, but in the end, his horrific past caught up with him.
This was one of the first cases in the world that DNA evidence played a factor.
When Jerald Wingeart was at last brought to justice, he was finally recognized as one of the world's most evil killers. In 1973, Dawn and Dawn Magyar were high school sweethearts, married with a 1-year-old son. When Dawn vanished while out shopping, the close-knit community of Owosso, Michigan, was terrified.
Where she was abducted, groceries on the ground, truck door open, foggy night and everything, we knew something really bad had happened.
It was an unsolved case for so many years. It was just part of the local lore. Whoever this is, they're still out there. And who knows who else they've abducted and killed.
Evil had invaded this rural idyll. Dawn's friends and family wouldn't see peace or justice for almost 30 years. This killer story begins on the 15th of January 1941 in a small town just 130 miles from Owosso, with the birth of Jerald Leroy Wingeart.
He was from Niles, Michigan, which is almost to the Indiana border.
Wingeart was one of 5 children in a close, ordinary, middle-class family.
What we know of Wingeart's background wouldn't really suggest the things that were to happen later in his life. You can hide in a big family, and perhaps you're not under so much attention.
In high school, he was an athlete. He was considered fairly intelligent, well-liked.
He seemed like the all-American boy. Actually had a football scholarship.
In June 1959, aged just 18, Wingeart married his first wife, an 18-year-old girl from his hometown. A few months later, he enrolled at university, and the couple moved to Ann Arbor.
He went to the University of Michigan. He was, to all intents and purposes, hard-working. Late in 1960, this upright university student is involved in a car accident with his then partner, which puts an end to his athletic career. In the wake of the car accident, the couple have a baby, a little boy. But the tragedy continues to strike them, and after 7 months, the baby dies unexpectedly.
4 months later, in July 1961, a fellow student at the university suffered a harrowing attack.
A young woman and her boyfriend. The young woman was blind. They were traveling in his car. They decided to stop on the side of a rural road and spend a little time together. While they were sitting there, they noticed a car drive by them, kind of slow. The next thing they know, a man gets out of the driver's side of the car, and they can see that he's got a rifle in his hand.
He asked the girl to tie up the boy, but she couldn't because she was blind. So he ordered her back into the car and he tied up the boy.
He then proceeded to take her purse, take his wallet, take his keys, move some stuff from the vehicle that he was in into their car. And then he put the girl into the car and drove off with her.
As a 19-year-old blind girl at that time, taken from her boyfriend, taken to an unknown location, she had no idea where she was at, and then brutally raped.
Having brutalized the young woman, the attacker left her tied up in a ditch next to a remote country road.
He told her to walk away, and she struggled in this rural area to get away from him, and she hid. And when she knew that he was finally gone and likely not coming back, she worked her way somehow back out to the road and flagged down a motorist that brought her care.
When police returned to the scene, they found the woman's boyfriend still alive and an incriminating piece of evidence.
They find that the car that the suspect left there appeared to be his own car, and it was Jerald Wingeart's car.
He told somebody about what he'd done, ended up going to a lawyer, and he was advised to go to the police and hand himself in, which is what he did. But he didn't hand himself in out of any remorse or guilt or shame or anything like that, because he basically said, well, I had a blackout, I can't remember anything that I did. Yeah, I'll accept it was me, but I have no memory of it.
He was charged with the armed robbery and the sexual assault.
Tried before a judge, Wingeart pled insanity. Several experts argued he was suffering from a schizoid personality disorder.
This would certainly explain those behaviours of violence and the rapes, and would certainly have an impact on the rest of his life and the way that he was going to behave.
In spite of Wingeart's protestations of his innocence, he was convicted of the rape and robbery and sent to jail for 8 years. His wife divorced him shortly after his incarceration.
Freed in 1969, Wingeart quickly remarried, had a daughter, and forged a career in the relatively new field of computer programming. The family settled in the Lansing area of Michigan, just a 30-minute drive from the small city of Owosso, a place that was struck by tragedy on the 27th of January 1973 with the disappearance of 20-year-old local woman Dawn Magyar.
She was at home in Chesneen with her husband and one-year-old child. She left Chesneen to come to Owosso to do some shopping. Once she got here, she started having car trouble. So she called up her father-in-law and made arrangements to borrow his truck so she could finish her errands. So she went over to his house, got the truck, and then from there, she made a couple of stops, and then she went to a plaza just north of Owosso called the Yankee Plaza.
That was a pretty small shopping center. It only had like maybe 3 stores or businesses in it.
Author Billy Bates was a child living in the Owosso area in 1973.
We were in that shopping plaza all the time. And so when this happened, when Dawn Magyar was abducted, I remember my mom talking about it because she was a young mom herself.
She stopped in there to do some shopping at the store. When she didn't make it back home, her husband started getting concerned, and then he eventually came into Owosso to file a missing persons report.
She was not the type of person you would expect to go missing. Immediately, as soon as she was reported, really, she was seen as a high-risk victim. This is totally out of character.
They found her father-in-law's truck out in the strip mall parking lot.
The door was open. The items that she bought were in the vehicle. There was a couple of keys from the keychain, one laying on the floor in the truck and one laying on the ground outside the truck. Early on, they felt that there was some foul play involved, and they started acting on that accordingly.
Dawn was known in the area as a popular young woman from a close family.
She grew up in Corona. and she had 2 brothers. She lived at home with her mother and father, who were very loving. She did well in high school. She had a lot of friends, well-liked person.
Just a real down-to-earth, friendly Midwestern girl, you know?
Journalist Tony Horners got to know Dawn at high school in Corona.
She was gorgeous, strawberry blonde, little freckly, I would say. She was in the group with a bunch of us, you know, parties after football games and, you know, just that kind of thing, school activities.
Dawn and her husband, Don, got together in high school and eventually married in 1971 and had a child.
Having just celebrated her son's first birthday, Dawn was now missing under suspicious circumstances.
So at the time that she was abducted, it was very foggy. The fog was thick, and would have been very easy for somebody to kidnap someone without being seen.
The police got a search party going, and there were hundreds of people there. You know, I was there, and we did grid searches around the county. We all knew we were looking for a body.
After more than 5 weeks of daily searches, tirelessly scouring the rural area on foot and on horseback, the fears of volunteers like Tony were realized. News of a gruesome discovery less than 10 miles from where the 20-year-old mother had last been seen alive spelled tragedy for Dawn Magyar's friends and family.
On March 4th, 1973, there were 2 boys up in the Oakley area. Their family had a maple syrup operation, so they had a lot of maple trees. And their job was to go out that day and just check the trees. And while they were doing this, they found what looked like a human being to them on the ground. So the state police responded up there, and they were able to determine that it was Dawn Magyar.
It appeared that she had been abducted and murdered and was also raped prior to her death.
The violent homicide of a young mother was a shockingly unusual occurrence in Owosso County. While investigators waited for the results of Dawn's autopsy, her murder became the only thing local people were talking about.
It's a rural area, very low crime back in those days.
Maybe somebody would break into somebody's car, maybe break into their house once in a while, but murder, oh my gosh, never.
Well, at this point, it obviously turned into a homicide investigation. There were a couple of pretty good suspects back when this happened, but they never had anything conclusive to show that any one of those people had committed the crime.
First rule like that in law enforcement is you're gonna look at the people closest to her, you know, the husband and everything. Rock solid alibi, no way could Don have done this, took polygraphs. No, he was home with his son.
As public fears mounted and with a murderer on the loose, detectives hoped that Dawn's remains would give them the answer to who had killed her.
Because of the cold weather, there was not a lot of decomposition. She was found face down on the ground. Her coat was buttoned up in the front, and her arms were inside her coat, not the sleeves, so that the coat was kind of like a straitjacket, and a bullet hole in the back of the jacket. And then, of course, subsequently in the autopsy, they discovered there were 2 other bullets.
The forensic evidence that was collected at the time was exquisitely preserved through some real fine police work and scene work.
So what the medical examiner found was that she had been shot once in the back and twice in the back of the head with .22 caliber bullets. And they were able to recover the bullets from her body.
Dawn had also been raped, and the killer had left behind vital evidence.
So during the autopsy, they did a vaginal swab, and when it was tested later by the lab, there was a presence of semen.
Physicians who did the autopsy had collected the semen samples from her and literally put them in like a sandwich bag, back then. It's crazy to think about that. And then they put it in storage. Back then, of course, all you could do was match blood types. There was nothing else you could really do.
The blood type detected from Dawn Magyar's attacker did not match either of the police's main suspects. But the following summer, 18 months after Dawn's murder, another significant clue emerged.
In 1974, there was a couple of boys swimming in the Shiawassee River right in Owosso, just off on the north side of the bridge on Main Street. They stumbled across something laying on the bottom of the river. They picked it up, and it was a gun.
Would have been easy for anyone driving by or to exit a vehicle and throw items out from that location. The firearm was a .22 caliber revolver. Because of the deterioration of the firearm in the river, the rusting and so forth, they were unable to ballistically prove that it was involved.
Because of the circumstances, the location it was found, the ammunition, the right make and model of the gun, they believed that this was the murder weapon.
Detectives now had the gun they believed had been used to kill Dawn Magyar, but they still did not know who it belonged to.
The investigators were able to trace that firearm back to a pawn shop in Yuma, Arizona, and they were able to obtain a name of Robert Shaw. But when they went to that address, Mr. Shaw had already moved, and they were unable to track him any further.
2 years later, police detectives made another discovery.
In 1976, again, there was a couple of kids playing in the river, this time south of the bridge, south of where the gun had been found, and they found a wallet laying on the bank of the river, not too far from the water. That wallet was turned in to the police, and it was found to have the identification of Dawn Magyar.
So this guy definitely came back through Owosso and pitched it off this bridge. And the Shiawassee River is one of the very few rivers in the world that run from south to north. And so when he threw it out, it kept drifting downstream.
It offered no other information at that point, no evidence or anything, but it also helped confirm that this gun that was found 2 years before would be the gun that was used in this crime.
By the late 1970s, with no new information to help catch Dawn's killer, the trail had gone cold. A body blow for the community, but especially for the young woman's family.
Dawn's father continued to search for her killer after she was found and spent most of his time doing that. And the family felt that eventually contributed to his death was his obsession with trying to find out who killed her.
In April 1979, a teenage girl, Laura Mae McVeigh, disappeared just a few miles away from Owosso and in shockingly similar circumstances.
She was a 16-year-old high school student who I believe was on their high school track team or cross-country team. She was jogging along a road, as I recall, and then just turned up missing.
There was a witness that seen her talking to someone in a van. And then after that, she was never seen again until her body was later found in another county further north. Her body had been outside for quite a while, so there was some decomposition, but they were able to determine that she had been strangled, and that was how she died. And there was evidence that she was sexually assaulted, but there was no semen.
This time, the police quickly identified a suspect.
Somebody had observed a strange or suspicious van in the area, wrote that registration or license plate number down. After this individual who had written this license plate number down heard about the abduction and the death of Laura McVeigh, and turned that information over to the police.
The van turned out to belong to 38-year-old Jerald Wingeart, who'd been in the Hubbardston area at the time.
He was up fishing with his brother and another friend, and he left the same night, said, I gotta go home, I gotta go do something. And he just went cruising.
Wingeart's pattern seems to be attacking and sexually assaulting vulnerable, young, isolated women. He was out looking for somebody who fitted that kind of profile.
When police ran a background check on their suspect, they uncovered his conviction 20 years earlier for rape. And when they searched his van, they found fibers they believed had come from Laura McVeigh's blue jogging suit.
He was charged with murder, but there were lots of arguments about whether the evidence was admissible, whether the police had collected it in the right way, whether it was a lawful search. And he was really, really lucky there because some of the key evidence just wasn't able to be presented to the court.
The judge dismissed it, and he walks away.
As the trial collapsed for the murder of Laura McVeigh, Wingeart left the courthouse with a smile on his face, insisting to the press and to the public that he was an innocent man and that he had done nothing wrong whatever. It was a gigantic fraud.
He may have proclaimed his innocence, but after his release, officers witnessed firsthand Jerald Wingeart's predatory habits.
The Michigan State Police did surveil him for quite some time, and what they learned from that, he would often leave the Lansing area where he resided and would travel to strip clubs in the Detroit area. But instead of taking the freeway system in Michigan that would offer the fastest and most direct route, he would take the back roads and would always cut through various college campuses.
What the detectives believed at that time is that he was trolling. He was out looking for a victim, someone that he could abduct without being seen.
Wingeart was never caught in the act, and the surveillance operation was eventually called off.
He dropped off the radar at that point.
The man that investigators were certain was responsible for killing Laura McVeigh was free to roam the streets of Owosso. But Jerald Wingeart's luck was about to change. 2 decades after the notorious unsolved murder of Dawn Magyar in Shiawassee County, evidence from the crime scene was still sitting on a shelf in a Michigan crime lab, including semen samples found in Dawn's body.
Back in the 70s, they really weren't that sophisticated with DNA, but they had recovered DNA from her, and they preserved it.
In 1994, Michigan started getting involved with DNA evidence, DNA technology.
Biological samples that had previously only revealed a perpetrator's blood type could now produce a DNA profile that would match a single individual. This is exactly what the State Crime Lab managed to do with the Dawn Magyar case in the mid-1990s.
They were able to build this profile, this DNA profile on our unknown killer.
I became the detective at the Owosso Post in November of 1998, and I actually took an interest in the unsolved homicide cases at the Post. The Magyar case, to me, was the most promising because there was DNA evidence.
Detective Mark Pendergraft was determined to solve the 25-year-old cold case and catch a predatory killer. He now had the DNA of the man who'd raped Dawn Magyar before she was murdered, but there was no match on the police database.
You have a DNA profile, which is great, but you have no idea who it belongs to, so you still basically have a whodunit.
Also preserved in evidence was the handgun found dumped in the Shiawassee River in 1974.
It was actually Mark's idea to focus our efforts on a firearm that had been found within a year of this murder.
So we turned back towards the gun to see if that could lead us to somebody.
When Mark told me this case is solvable, we got the gun, and that's when I really believed too that it could be solved.
In 1974, the gun had been registered to a man named Robert Shaw, but the police hadn't been able to find him. In 1999, they tried again. In an unexpected breakthrough, they quickly discovered that Robert Shaw was living in Lansing, Michigan.
Now we're excited we got the connection of that gun getting to Michigan. So we started investigating Robert Shaw. And then eventually we contacted him for an interview.
He specifically recalled buying a .22 caliber revolver from a pawn shop in Yuma, Arizona when he was stationed in the Army down there, and that he had purchased it for plinking and shooting jackrabbits and so forth.
He didn't know what happened to the gun. He knew he didn't have it anymore. He thought maybe he had traded it to a friend, but really had no idea. So we interviewed him extensively. We did our background investigation on him. We actually ran a polygraph, and he came back inconclusive. So now we're wondering, was he involved in the crime?
Detectives knew there was one surefire way to eliminate Shaw as a suspect.
So when they did a DNA test on him, it was no match that was in her.
It was another dead end. Until a few months later when Robert Shaw contacted Detective Steve Harshberger out of the blue.
He called me up one day and he said, "Steve, I've got another name I want to give you. I was looking at a case of wine. This case of wine made me remember a guy that my ex-wife began having an affair with back in the early 70s.
And it reminded him of the name of Wingeart. And that's how he finally remembered this name. So he provided us with that name.
She eventually left me for this guy. And I remember his first name was Jerry.
He thinks that the gun became missing around that time and Gerald might have taken it.
Investigators began to gather everything they could about this new suspect.
We found out that in 1961, he had been convicted of a robbery and a rape in Ann Arbor of a blind woman. And we also found that he had been arrested in 1981 for a 1979 homicide in Ionia. So this was the first time that we had a suspect that had the background and the propensity for doing this type of crime.
And we both became extremely excited at the potential that this was our killer. It was at that time that he and I put all of our energy into Mr. Wingeart to either identify him properly through DNA evidence or eliminate him and keep moving on.
In 2000, we had surveillance done on him. And what we were looking to do was to get a DNA sample.
By the year 2000, 59-year-old Jerald Wingeart was living with his latest wife just outside Detroit.
Wingeart was married 4 times, so, quite the ladies' man, I guess. But he'd been dormant for a lot of years, living a quiet life in Sterling Heights.
He was a computer whiz, and people liked him, kept to himself, quiet. He was very bright from what I recall, and but he was a charmer.
He's got a good job. He's blending in with his environment, just like everyone else does. But in secret, he's got this other life that he at least had lived at one time and may have continued.
Owosso detectives started following their suspect's every move.
What we had the surveillance team looking for was him to discard a cigarette, chewing gum, a pop bottle, anything of that nature that would contain his DNA. And unfortunately, during the whole time they were surveilling him, he never discarded anything like that.
While their team was trying to prove a link between their suspect and the DNA traces left on Dawn Magyar's body, Mark and Steve were finding other links between Dawn's case and Wingeart's other suspected or confirmed attacks, starting with the rape of the blind student over 3 decades earlier.
We found that a girl was abducted. The weapon used was a .22 caliber. The victim was abducted from a rural area, transported to another rural area where she was raped. But the other thing that we found very interesting was the victim from 1961, her underwear were missing. Dawn Magyar, it was found that her underwear were missing. The other thing that we found that was similar was that he had tied the victim's hands behind her back in 1961. In 1973, Dawn's arms were inside of her coat, not in the arm sleeves, but inside of her coat, and the coat was zipped up, in effect acting like a straitjacket.
The officially unsolved murder of Laura McVeigh in 1979 also carried intriguing similarities.
We were able to get photographs of the different scenes associated with Laura McVeigh that the location where her body was found, you could almost superimpose on top of Dawn Magyar's scene where her body was found. The position of the bodies and so forth, the type of rural area, it was strange. They were almost identical.
Detectives were building a case, but it was purely circumstantial. They doubted it would be enough to secure a conviction.
We need to tie him in through DNA. We need to definitively show that he was the one who left the semen deposits in Dawn Magyar's body that were recovered.
So what they ended up doing was doing a trash pull. When we put our trash out by the curbside, all of a sudden it becomes a public entity.
So I just pulled up to the curb, I jumped out, grabbed 4 bags of trash, threw them in my car, and drove off.
In November 2000, 32 cigarette butts from Jerald Wingeart's garbage bags were sent to the state crime lab in Lansing, Michigan. Through the winter and early spring, the cold case detectives waited to find out if they had finally cracked the Dawn Magyar murder case and could take a dangerous man off the streets. When the call finally came, it was incredible news.
I eventually heard back from the lab, and they said we found a DNA match on a Merit brand cigarette butt.
Total excitement. It was unbelievable that we were able to finally put a name with the DNA profile that we had from a case in 1973 to somebody that was likely involved in at least one other homicide of a girl that he got away with it. And now it was looking like we were going to be able to put a case together on him.
Questioned by the police on the 7th of March 2001, Jerald Wingeart denied visiting Owosso or ever meeting Dawn Magyar.
I reached down into my bag and I said, "Let me show you a picture of her." And he says, "I don't know her. I've never seen her before."
And at this point, he became extremely agitated, began slamming his fist on the table. "Look, I've told you once, I'm not going to tell you again. I don't know her, I've never met her, I've never had sex with her, I don't know this woman."
When the police interrogated Wingeart for the first time, they found him out in a series of lies. He certainly had been in the Owosso area at the time of Dawn's disappearance. He certainly knew her. The DNA proved that. And gradually, it became abundantly clear that there was a case to be answered, and Wingeart had to answer it.
He said, "Well, guess what? You're under arrest for the murder of Dawn Magyar."
We informed him that we did have a search warrant for DNA and other biological evidence, and that we were going to be collecting that from him. And it was very hard to read his emotions. He was angry, but he also seemed scared. And I think he knew at that point it was done, that we had him.
So then right after that, we knew we needed to go tell Dawn Magyar's mother that we had gotten her man. She was quite elderly at the time. So we broke the news to her kind of easily that we had found the man that was responsible for her daughter's murder, and he was locked up in jail. She was obviously very grateful after all this time that we had gotten a man that had killed her daughter.
In November 2001, Jerald Wingeart stood trial for the murder of Dawn Magyar. For the first time, the people of Owosso County got a look at the bogeyman who'd cast a shadow over the area for 28 long years.
It was a very arrogant, defiant type of demeanor that he was portraying throughout this proceeding, this trial.
He was cocky. He'd always turn around laughing at his daughter.
Kind of had this look to his face like he didn't care about other people. That was the kind of look that he had on his face.
Investigators desperately hoped that a case years in the making would be enough to convict him.
First off and foremost, we had semen which had DNA. Secondly, we had the gun. And the gun was very important because without that gun, we never get to Jerald Wingeart.
Attorney Vince Green represented Wingeart.
He admitted that they had sex, but he said it was consensual sex.
His defense was that he had met the victim, who was a stranger they had just met. They had consensual sex, and then they parted ways, and when they did, she was still alive.
To Dawn's family, Wingeart's claims were a further violation and an insult to his victim's memory.
Oh, I think they were all offended and angry that he would insinuate that, number one, she would cheat on her husband, and number two, that she would be the type of girl that would just meet somebody and have sex with them.
The DNA evidence that linked Wingeart to the crime also revealed a time frame. The sexual intercourse had to have taken place around the time of the murder.
The spermatozoa still had tails attached. There's a short time window or time period where those tails began breaking off. And in her case, those tails were still attached. Her body had been preserved in the middle of winter in Michigan, outdoors. And so our forensic experts were able to testify to the fact that whoever left this seminal evidence in Dawn was likely the killer.
It was powerful testimony, but it relied on a jury comprehending the strength of the DNA evidence, still a relatively new field at the time. But prosecutors were also able to prove that Jerald Wingeart had a history of violent sexual attacks on women.
The clincher was when the woman he raped in 1961 walked into the courtroom with her leader dog, and that was heart-wrenching, testimony.
When she testified to all this and went through all the graphic detail that was involved in this rape and sexual assault, the jury kept looking at her, and then they'd look at him, and they'd look at her, and they'd look. Every time a new detail would come out from her, they'd look right at him, and then he would just kind of show that defeat.
The girls that were associated with him as victims had a similar build. They were petite, they had blonde or strawberry blonde hair. He seemed to have a thing for that type of woman. There was a juror who fit this profile of the type of woman he liked. And we all noticed during the trial, he spent a lot of time staring at this juror. It was a little spooky.
On November the 26th, 2001, the jury retired to consider whether Jerald Leroy Wingeart was guilty of first-degree murder.
When the jury went out for deliberations, he said something to the deputy who was keeping an eye on him. He says, "Get my bill ready at the jail because I'm going to be checking out." He was confident he was going to be found not guilty. I thought that we had put together a lot of circumstantial evidence, a lot of similar acts evidence. We had our DNA, and we had a gun, so I felt really confident.
How do you find reasonable doubt when there isn't any? When you have DNA evidence that is so clearly indicating that whoever killed this person did it probably right before or right after they had sex with this person.
After 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Wingeart guilty of premeditated first-degree murder.
I was elated. This guy who was not only responsible for Dawn's death, most likely responsible for Laura McVeigh's death, was certainly responsible for the rape and robbery involving this other lady back in '61, and quite frankly, maybe others, was now going to pay the price. He was caught, and now he was going to pay for what he did.
The sentencing for this type of conviction, first-degree murder and felony murder, there's only one sentence he can get, and that's life in prison with no parole.
Jerald Wingeart was finally facing the music for the murder of Dawn Magyar, something he never expected to have to do.
His jaw dropped and he was just looking in disbelief when they said guilty. He was so, like I said, he was so confident that he was going to be going home right after this, that he just couldn't believe that he was found guilty.
Wingeart did not want to get caught. He didn't like being held to account. For some serial offenders, they don't care. It's part of the game. Wingeart didn't like it. It actually quite frightened him, I think.
Jerald Leroy Wingeart died in prison in August 2022. He never officially admitted to any further murders, though investigators had their suspicions about the man who habitually cruised rural back lanes on the lookout for lone females.
He did a lot of traveling. He'd been to a lot of states, and plus did a lot of traveling in Michigan. So the potential for murder was certainly there.
It was definitely on his mind. They're quite compulsive and obsessive serial killers. It's very, very difficult, I think, to get rid of a compulsion or an obsession. And whereas they might be able, maybe, to control things, I don't think the compulsion ever goes away.
I do believe that Jerald Wingeart was involved in many more homicides.
There was one former cellmate of his that we had talked to, and that cellmate said that Wingeart had told him that there were 9 bodies.
Jerald Wingeart's crimes against young women started young, at just 20 years old. For those who knew him, his violent sexual offending came out of nowhere. But once he'd embarked upon a path of predatory behavior, he didn't know how to stop. Wingeart took the peace of mind, the security, and in some cases the lives of the young women unlucky enough to cross his path. But in 2001, he finally paid the price for being one of the world's most evil killers.